Welcome to Uncommon Ground, Speaking Over Shouting. Today we'll be discussing media and its influence on not just politics, but on the public. My name is Elijah Wharton, and I'm joined by.
Jason Moline,
And
and
Andrew Durand.
All right, and I'm going to be starting us out today. Uh, and when we decided on this topic, we were kind of discussing a few things, and media came up, and we immediately decided we wanted to talk about media. And I actually, I was big on this because I've there's a few things about media that I wanted to discuss. Uh, Mostly, and I'll touch on the two biggest things about media in this. I did this last week. I approach things in a way where I'll split them up into like subcategories. And so when I was thinking about media, I was thinking about the what are the jobs of media? What is news's role in society, and at least in an ideal world. And so the three big things that I came across of were to provide factual storytelling, uh, hold elective officials accountable, and to be a voice of the people. And those last two kind of go hand in hand, but the first one and the second one are kind of like the big two. And so in terms of providing facts, I think that privatization of the media has kind of led to fighting for audiences. And so that leads to two big problems, which is straying from the facts and an inability to hold the elected officials accountable. And so the first is a little clearer, where they're fighting for audiences. And so they basically led reporters to kind of splitting the political ladder and finding a group that they are set to appeal to. And so now everyone really has their set group. Like Fox appeals to the right, MSNBC and CNN appeal more to the left, and the box is basically guarantees them a a set amount of viewers based on their ideology. And so this can lead from a more fact-based storytelling to more opinion spouting, or even in some extreme cases, blatant propaganda. And so feeding into this fight for an audience, really, it kind of cycles back into itself in terms of creating a sort of misinformation, because of a misinformation like cycle. Because if facts are out of the storytelling, or at least they're not as obvious in the storytelling, it becomes much harder to find the true story. And so I found I got a notification from Twitter this week, actually, where I was really surprised to see this because it's kind of convenient. And the notification was: Politico and Fox News issue conflicting reports on the possibility of House of Representatives returning early to act or to address the USPS issues, which got me thinking. It was like, they should know, before even publishing a story, they should know whether or not the House of Representatives is reconvening to discuss these issues or not. Like, it shouldn't be a conflict of what's actually happening. Especially, like, if the facts are there, then the story should be the same across all boards, or at least similar in some way. Um, the second role of media was to hold elected officials accountable, and partly due to a competing for an audience, reporters in the media have kind of strayed from their original strategy, or at least their older strategy of kind of cooperating to achieve this common goal. And this has happened more so in the past. It's become more obvious in the past 4 years, uh, and especially in the with the White House press briefings. So the an example of this happening is or the generality of this happening. I'll give a generality and then I'll go into a more specific example, because this specific example happened very, very recently also. Um, reporters in the White House press briefing basically ask a strongly worded question, or that really presses either the president or Kayleigh McEnany, the secretary of the press, uh, about, uh, or they press them on an issue and ask them a question that would make them have to really think about their answer. And instead of answering the questions, the official, whoever it is, either Trump or McEnany, are able to just jump to a new reporter for a question now, instead of the old camaraderie that reporters used to have for one another, where they would help each other press the official and kind of work for the people to try and get answers out of the officials. And a great example of that not in action is this week a reporter asked Trump, quote, "Do you regret all the lying you've done to the American people over the past 3.5 years?" And immediately Trump disregarded the question and just jumped to a new reporter. And the new reporter said, "Well, I want to talk about the payroll tax cut." And they went and just completely ignored the question that the reporter was trying to press Trump on. And it's I don't embarrassing's not the word, but it's kind of, I'll say annoying for lack of a better term. It's kind of annoying that the officials can kind of just ignore being pressed on an issue if they don't want to be, and the media just lets that happen. So it's really created this lack of people, or citizens of our nation having a basically a deafened voice. And so the papers can give people like a artificial voice through like op-eds and through publishing like written pieces or whatever, but it's they're like where they're allowed to express their opinions openly. But even then, they're kind of being put in a funnel where the what they write may not be approved by whoever is writing the paper, especially if they're not a renowned person. It's harder to get an op-ed. But even then, even if you are trying to get an op-ed, it is if your content really doesn't go with what what the paper stands for, then in terms of like political ideologies, your chances of getting an op-ed are a lot harder. And so but even with that issue, I kind of think that's what separates them from social media, is that there is the actual filter of information. And I have yet to determine if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But what are your guys' thoughts?
Ooh, that's a lot there. All
Yeah,
right,
that's a lot.
let's unpack that. So you started off with
Factual storytelling as well.
factual storytelling by the media, and
Yeah.
how it's just sort of lost, or not. Well, there is still very good reporting. It's not as consistent as it used to be, and people are more concerned with clicks and views than actually reporting correctly. I wanted to make a quick comment on you, like, classifying the media. I would say, yeah, Fox News is more to the right, but MSNBC and CNN, they're in no way to the left. Like, if anything is slightly left, it's
that's wrong.
CNN.
Well,
They are
so-
centrist media.
I would disagree with that. I would say MSNBC and CNN are left-wing media. Now they may not be as far left as Fox is right, but they are clearly a left media.
Yeah, but MSNBC, for example, brings on significantly more Republicans than it does progressives. Like,
Yeah.
it had the progressive representation with it. It's a little better in CNN, but especially in
Well,
MSNBC, is
I
just
feel
almost non-existent.
and here's something that I've come to recognize. I think CNN gets uh right wing politicians kind of place CNN further left than it actually is, and they do the opposite for MSNBC. I think MSNBC in terms of content is more left than CNN, but since there's more of a narrative behind CNN, it gets kind of booted over more left than it actually is.
Well,
I actually, when we were digging through all this stuff, I went out on my way and found the updated version of that media bias chart, and it was interesting to me that CNN Online ranks closer to the center than CNN cable news, which actually makes total sense in my head because I can sit down and read a CNN article without getting too wildly like
It's because there's not a
without
voice
becoming
behind it.
enraged. But whenever I watch CNN, it just the way they behave seems much more inflammatory, which is I think true of almost anything because shows are based on ratings
Yeah,
and
you have to be interesting to get ratings.
yeah.
I think that was the whole point behind behind what I was saying is that they care less about the story than they do about the views. They care less about the story than they do about the clicks. They care less about the story than they do about the information, or than they do about the well-being of the people. Because I think the facts are essential to having a not only a healthy media environment, but having a correct information cycle through the everyday people. And I think that's good for discussing the fact portion of that because I think that was the main thing to get out of it is that they're so focused on the ratings. But what do you guys think about the media's effectiveness in holding elected officials accountable?
I think the media's effectiveness in holding officials accountable becomes limited as soon as you sacrifice accuracy for speed.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Let's take that question for example. You cited the Trump question, which I also read about, where a reporter sits there and he asks him, "Do you regret all like the X amount of times you've lied to the American people?" And he just moves on. Why should he answer that question? From like the question itself is phrased in a directly inflammatory fashion, and there's no way to answer that question in a way that like satisfies anyone or really does anything. The question itself is so directly and pointedly biased because the person asking the question is more interested. It like by asking the question, he doesn't actually need a response because he already got what he wanted by asking the question.
That's fair.
Right.
I could understand that because I as much as I agree with that question being the question itself is fact based. I mean, Trump has lied to the people thousands of times, but I do believe that the question had malintent. Like it wasn't a nice question. But I mean, not every question is going to be a nice question, and I think that's part. I think that's
nor should they be. Like questions, especially difficult questions, are like they're really difficult to answer, and they take time to really consider and think about. But the question itself doesn't go anywhere that hasn't already been talked about or explored. The question doesn't bring anything new to light. It's not going to change anybody's mind. It's going to entrench both sides continually.
And I think that the question itself, it provides an opportunity for correction. And I think that's part of holding officials accountable is that the media can provide the officials a voice back to the people as the media provides a voice for the people. And so by asking these hard-hitting questions, it presses the officials on these issues, and it gives them an opportunity to correct where they've been wrong. And that's I think that's one of my biggest thing about officials is it's okay if you've done something wrong in your past if you apologize for it and correct your behavior. And I think being able to do that as an official is really important. And so by giving them these opportunities, like this would have been a perfect opportunity for Trump to say, I know I've misled the public in the past, but I apologize for that, and I will try harder to move on. Something along those lines, something to convince the American people that he means what he says, and he's trying to turn a new leaf. But I think at a certain point, it's a little too far gone for him. But the opportunity was there, and he's received opportunities like this in the past, and he just hasn't capitalized on them. And at this point, he's gained the ability to just ignore the questions completely.
It's like wondering what you guys think. How far does that go? Like, for example, Obama's and Trump both engaged, as well as Bush. They all engaged in drone strikes that were knowingly had the possibility of hitting civilians and did hit civilians. So in those events where civilian casualties are actively just accepted, do you think something like that can even be apologized for?
So for me, I think it's part of an apology is the art of correction. And I think that it's hard to apologize for something that is A, so vile, and B, bound to be repeated. And so it's difficult to issue a sincere apology about something of that nature. Even with, like, I feel like if an apology were to come of that, it would be along the lines of being something where they basically try to lessen. I don't know if lessen the lives of the citizens, or not the citizens, the civilians who died, more so as kind of making it seem like it's for the greater good. Like the drone strike killed civilians, but it also killed some really, really bad people. Like that kind of storytelling.
There are situations where that is true, but most of them are that's just not true, and the civilian casualties led to more people within the regions getting radicalized. So all they had was negative effects: death, radicalization, no targets hit. It's completely wasteful. But just going off that, I wanted to ask whether or not an apology for something like that is even credible if that person no longer has the ability to commit that action.
Hang on, fire that question at me one more time.
So if the individual apologizing cannot commit the action they are apologizing for anymore, is that apology as meaningful or meaningful at all? Well, I guess there's always some meaning to all apologies.
I think what we're missing from this particular discussion, and I think it actually also loops back a little bit to the question that Trump just abandoned, is that we're talking about really, really, we're not being specific enough. You know what I'm like? So when you say drone strikes, which is a big blanket statement, and you say that some of them could potentially be justified, but you haven't defined which ones could be justified. So it's difficult to say which ones could be or should be apologized for.
I see what I see what you're saying, and I think that's part of what I was getting at is where some of them can be apologized for with the line, well, it was for the greater good, but not all of them. And so that's the issue with asking a question that's like a blanket statement is it's hard to hit the ones that really require the apology. And at the same time, it's really hard, especially in the conversation of drone strikes, to uh, uh, to come up with a truly meaningful a truly meaningful apology. And I think, and this is looping back to the original question you asked, uh, if they do not have if they no longer have the power to do a certain thing, I think apologies can be accepted, but they won't be as valuable as if they still have the power to do that. And I think part of that has to do or not part of that has to do with, but more so an example of that could be uh like Nazi soldiers who are basically radicalized and wow, I feel like every episode we loop back to Nazis.
We've only had 2, and so far we've got 100% hit rate on Nazis. What a great
Um,
show!
Yeah, I know.
Well,
What a wonderful show.
It's pretty
Uh,
applicable to the times, though. There's a lot of modern day
fascism.
references. Well, yeah.
But that can be seen with like Nazi soldiers who were radicalized by Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich, and being able to do all of those horrible things when they had the power to, but whenever the after World War II, the fall of the Third Reich and the fall of the Nazi Party, uh, it was they no longer had the power, or at least they no longer had the power backing them to be able to pull off these attacks. And some of them who felt they had been brainwashed issued apologies, and of that some were accepted.
I think it has less. I think the Nazi thing specifically, I think, has less to do with power and more to do with being able to defer to authority. You're far more willing, and we talked about this with the Milgram experiments last time, that you're far more willing to do terrible things if someone else has accepted the blame prematurely. Like if you have a commanding officer, then you can commit atrocities and say, well, I was following orders. If your brain can conceive of a way out of responsibility for the situation you're in, you're far more likely to do something horrendous.
Yeah, and I think that loops back to the drone strikes. Wow, full circle.
Boom.
But where it's easy to give that order, and it's easy for the order to be taken out, and it's easy for both parties to feel that they're not at fault, where the person giving the order isn't the one actually doing the action, and the person taking the action is given the order to do so, and so they have a scapegoat as well. And so it's like an endless circle of placing the blame on one another, where there's no real confrontation about who's actually to blame. And I think that goes back to the media, where I think it's up to the media to really decide where the blame lies, and not just the media but the people in general. And that's part of being the voice of the people, is to kind of get the feel about where the blame should be, and then placing the blame and pressing the official and the person on the matter.
First of all, before we stray too far back from that topic, Jason, I know very little, really, if anything, about drone strikes. And so I would really like you to send me the stuff that you have on it, because I've never looked that up. I've never read anything. And now I'm curious.
It's been some time for me. I was just getting a real quick refresher.
Okay. Just like 30,000 foot overview.
Yeah. Like I'm still trying to check Trump's current numbers, but as of his first 2 years in office, he issued 2,243 drone strikes compared to Obama's 1,878 in his entire 8 years.
In 8 years?
Yeah. And,
Okay.
well,
I wonder how much of that is a consequence of. I wonder how much of that is a consequence of the fact that drones are becoming more relevant, and how
Or
much
if
of that
it's-
is a consequence of because I suppose you could also fire in use airstrikes as a
I don't know if those are counted.
substitute, I
Yeah, I was
guess.
about to say. Yeah, I don't know if those
Yeah.
are counted
They're
in that
not.
data or not. They're
They're
not. Okay.
not.
So yeah, well, yeah, I don't think drones were very prevalent until like
Well,
at
probably
least 2010,
Obama.
at least. Well,
It was-
like in like a specific year. I mean, Obama's term started in 2009. When did drones actually become?
Well, that's when the public
That's-
became aware about him, became aware of the atrocities due to a whistleblower who is now in jail for leaking the information that this is being done. And also, Trump, well, when he got into office, changed a ruling so that the public no longer gets the numbers for drone strikes. Or
Yeah.
Congress still gets the information, but Congress even like at the initial times, Congress wasn't even informed of civilian casualties through drone strikes. So it's all, a lot of it was just being
We
covered up.
might have to have a whole episode on drone strikes.
I don't think it would be next episode, but
Probably not.
at some point.
Well, I think you could also theoretically branch that into a broader topic of covert
Military.
operations by the military, and
Yeah.
talking about whether or not we should, and how extensive it theoretically might be, because it's probably going to be difficult to figure out things that are supposed to be covert, which is why we need journalists and people who are
Yes.
supposed to find out things that the government does not want us to find out.
Well, if those journalists are getting getting arrested and stuff like that for like looking for information, which is entirely within their rights to do so as journalists, like, just doesn't. It's a very hard topic to work with, and you can also tie in also domestic abuses.
One of the things that I had trouble with once I started digging into this topic, because I started digging my heels into the researching media and it's like what it's supposed to do and how it operates, probably around almost right after we finished last week, actually. Like I got on top of it and did some preliminary research really quick. But I felt like as soon as I started digging through articles and some data, I had pulled on a thread and it just kept going. Like, because like in your brain, you perceive the media as this it's a simple outpouring of information, but everything that loops around behind it is just massive. Like the media is the surface level of this colossal network of information gathering, and it is wild.
Oh yeah, intelligence services, U.S. globally, like all intelligence work is just absolutely like it's just insanely complicated. There's so much to it, and a lot of it is unknown. Just due to its nature.
I feel like I know less after trying to find out stuff than I did before, which is usually the sign that you're learning something.
Well,
so I'm happy about that.
Dunning-Kruger
I was about to say
effect.
that's like that's like saying, oh, I knew all about our solar system, and then I found out we're not the only solar system, or we're not the only galaxy out there, and so now I have to learn about every solar system, and I went from knowing everything about what I knew to knowing a little bit about what I know now. It's
the last thing I just really I wanted to quickly touch on was the nature of drone strikes themselves. In that the drone so far up in the sky, and like people can't see it. So what would be going on in the situation where a drone strike would occur is people living just normal day-to-day lives. Nothing, all of a sudden, no sign of any danger, and then all of a sudden, explosion. So living knowing that is a possibility is a huge like
It's
amount of
terrifying.
yeah, it's completely terrifying. And I definitely, people were radicalized due to just the fear of drone strikes. And
Yeah.
I want to go into this more later.
Yeah.
But personally, I think something like that is just inhumane in nature.
Yeah, and that's. I feel like military tactics would be a thing that we could dwell on more in the future. I think that would require more because you seem very
Yeah.
prepared on this, and Andy and I are very not prepared
Okay.
on this.
Not at all.
Yeah,
and
we will
so
save this one
and
for
so
later.
yeah, so I
Yeah,
feel
military
uncomfortable.
tactics, drone
I feel
strikes.
uncomfortable
Yeah,
commenting on it, other than its relation to the topic we're discussing now,
like
which is
media.
media. And so
Yes,
it should get more media attention, is what it should get.
it definitely
And
should.
I feel like uh that actually does suffer from the this is a term I'm going to coin now, uh the blood in the water complex, where it's you basically you beat a story until it stops selling, and then throw it to the fishes. And so drone strikes, oh my god, they're so like they're really bad. And the stories at first were probably like nonstop, like, oh my gosh, they're doing a drone strike or they did a drone strike today, this is so terrible, blah blah blah. And then after that story stopped selling because they were selling it every day, they just dropped it. And that a similar thing happened with the Black Lives Matter movement, where protests are still going on all over the country, and they're just not getting the media attention anymore because the media stopped caring after a week. And so it's they drop it, and then every once in a while they'll pick it back up because the story's new again, because they stopped selling it before and they waited X amount of time, and now it's a new story where they can revive the story and start selling it as new, or it's happening again where it never stopped happening in the first place.
Yeah. I think we're going to take a real short break, but we'll be right back. All right, guys, we are back from our break. First, I just wanted to quickly mention that there are conflicting figures in the amount of drone strikes during Obama's presidency, and I've not been able to verify either the larger or smaller number, one being around 500 and the other a little over 2,000, the one that I mentioned before. So I just wanted to clarify that. So we could talk about that later, but I wanted to ask you guys what you thought about, or what you think about advertiser conflicts with media, and like the conflict of interest, especially when it comes to like advertising medical stuff, which is illegal in almost every other country, to my knowledge. But first, I just want to discuss advertising conflicts in general and like conflicts of interest with stories.
What do you mean? Can you rephrase that? Because I guess I'm
Like,
not getting the gist of the question.
like for example, it can be in all types of media, like the Washington Post covering what's I can't even remember his name. Bloomberg. Yeah.
Mayor Bloomberg.
No, that's not the Washington. That's Bloomberg.
Yeah.
Washington Post. That's Bezos, but that still was a conflict of interest with them not reporting stories about that were negative towards Bezos. It's sort of like the owners of these companies.
Basically, the
protected.
privatization of media. Basically, the issue with the privatization of media.
Well, I don't technically have an issue with the privatization. It's more the privatization and then the protection of the individuals that are in control of that network or that publisher.
This is actually one of my favorite things to think about and talk about, because I see a very clear issue where you have Jeff Bezos owning an entire newspaper outlet all to himself. And
Mhm.
I think that kind of thing becomes more dangerous the more the how do I put this? It's less dangerous because he only owns one. He does own one, and that's significant. And I think that you could have a whole debate on whether or not he should even be allowed to do that. But I think generally it's okay because there are other news outlets that will cover anything that Amazon does with accuracy exceeding what is it the Washington Post that he owns?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, then the Washington Post will cover it. And on the flip side of that, then you can hear the argument of, well, if that's a problem, then can we just have the government run the media? And
That's also an issue.
that's a terrible idea.
Well, it's
I
a
want to share
similar.
my go-to story for why it's really dangerous to let the government control your information. And it's there is a Russian serial killer who I like to talk about. If I can find my data
Das
for it real
Notes.
quick. Das Notes is. Here we go. Here we go. His name was Andrei Chikatilo. He was a Russian serial killer active during the Soviet Union. He was active between the years of 1978 and 1990. And the police knew about where he operated, but the government suppressed the information being released because in a perfect communist society, it was impossible to have a serial killer. So they suppressed the information and allowed him to continue murdering, being a serial killer for like a ludicrous amount of time. And he primarily targeted children and he would eat some of them. So, like, we're talking about a truly horrifying individual, and the government suppresses information about that individual because that would make them look bad.
There
So
is
you
no
can't.
war in Ba Sing Se.
There's no war in Ba Sing Se. So yeah,
That's the same gist.
you can't have either side like completely owning it. But I do kind of like the idea of having, because the BBC is publicly something. Oh God, how do I put this? I think it's okay if the government has a news outlet that it can control, as long as they don't control all the news outlets.
I see. I think that's a similar thing with it. It's a similar issue with what you were saying, what we were saying about Jeff Bezos, and the difference is it's the government versus Amazon. They're both huge entities, and so them controlling a news outlet is fine when it's not the only news outlet. So if the government had a news outlet, that'd be okay. But if it was the only news outlet, that's where we run into the issue. And we said the same about Jeff Bezos. If Jeff Bezos controlled the only news outlet, then it's an issue. And so, and I think the issue lies in accountability. Is if they're the only news outlet, then they can't be held accountable for anything because they can just bury the story deep into the depths and just move on. But if they're not the only news outlet, then someone's going to find the story, and then the story gets out and there's blood in the water.
I actually while we were discussing this, I had this really interesting thought that there's a principle in business that speed is not more important, but it has a higher degree of importance than accuracy. Like you want to make, I'm going to jumble this quote really horribly, but if you make a decision in business with 90% of the information that you want available to you, then you've probably made the decision too late. So in business, it's more important to be fast.
Oh, and I think a great example of that is this is a recent example. I think it was with Obama's announcement of his vice president back in 2008. Some media outlet. I wish I had the exact people on this and the exact like facts on this, but I'm just gonna go with it because I know the gist of the story. Some news outlet reported like 3 days before Obama's announcement that Obama picked someone for vice president Like, it wasn't. I think it was Tim Kaine. I think they said he picked Tim Kaine for his vice president, which obviously he didn't. But they thought they had the story and they immediately jumped on it because if they were right, they knew it before everyone else. And if they're wrong, they can just report the new story later. And so it was about the speed at which they responded to the story. And so they didn't have all the facts, but I guess they got a lead or something, and they said, okay, Tim Kaine's the new VP or the new nominee for VP. And so immediately it was like, screw all the facts, screw thinking this through and making sure that we're not the only ones who have this story, to immediately like, oh my gosh, we're the only ones that have this story, send it out. And then they're wrong.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know exactly when that happened. I had this really surreal experience. I was eating food somewhere. It might have been like a dinosaur barbecue or something weird like that. But there was a newspaper from World War II on the wall that was describing the effects of the atomic bomb after we had bombed Japan. And it was so surreal to read an article that, like, in today's day and age would have been just vehemently colored in one direction or another, depending on who you asked. And it was just giving a description of what it was, where they had dropped it, when they had dropped it, approximating the casualties. Like the level of difference between reading something from the 40s and reading something that's written now for journalism was just wildly different. Because it used to be more important that you were right than you were fast. And I don't know when that changed, but my suspicion is it changed when we switched to cable news primarily, and the 24-hour news cycle and ratings became more important than getting it right.
For sure. And I think the movie Anchorman does a great parody of this, where it's like, with the scene where they first start covering car chases, it's like, it doesn't matter about the facts. They just started making up facts. And then the only important part about the story is that there was a car chase. None of the facts mattered. It was the fact that there's a car chase. And so they were the ones reporting it, and it was exciting. And that's all that mattered. But I think that, and I agree with where you were going with that, where that changed when it not when cable news came around, but you said when cable news became our primary source of media. And I think that's an important distinction. And because newspapers were, even after cable news came out, newspapers were still the primary form of media for a while. And it's as they've become increasingly obsolete, cable news has grown in strength. And even now, I feel like cable news is slowly starting to grow obsolete in terms of, or at least compared to like social media and on online news, like stuff like that. And so I feel like we're like in the overlap of the next overlap, where newspapers and cable news overlapped. We're in another overlap underneath, where all three are present.
Yeah.
But I think printed news is gonna slowly become more of a thing of the past.
On that topic, when I was doing some research on at the beginning of the week about this, I found out, and this astounded me, I didn't realize this was true, that there's more money in cable news, and it hasn't gone down yet. We haven't seen the peak of cable news yet.
Really?
They're still making more money, and they're still making far more money than any other method of delivering information. Like, just wildly, far and away. Like watching, like let me see if I can find this again. I might have put it in my bookmarks because it was just that good.
But
There's
But it was really interesting to find that out, because I thought that cable news was on its way out. Like, I just, in my head, I was like, that's an old, and it's probably a consequence of the fact that I'm young, relatively speaking. But I was just like, I don't use cable news to inform myself. I use various internet articles and YouTube. Like, that's how I find all my information.
I wrongingly use Twitter, like only Twitter.
Oh, Twitter's terrible
like,
for that.
Oof.
Twitter's got a lot of bias on it. But like okay, I wouldn't say only Twitter. I actually listen to another podcast. I know, right? I'm not advertising the podcast on here. I'm not going to tell you what it's called.
Why not?
No,
I
I'm
advertise Dinosaur Barbecue.
That's true. No, I do. I listen to. It's called Pod Save America. I actually really like it. It's more of a. It's definitely a left-based news outlet, but I think that it's it at least opens my eyes a little bit about everything that's going on. I mean, I know that there's two sides to every story, and that's an important thing to seek out. But I believe that whenever I'm looking actually into a story, that I'm trying to get all the facts first before I spout information. But
Yeah.
sometimes I don't have the exact facts, but I know the gist of the story.
I do want to say though that just quickly addressing the Washington Post and Bloomberg, that the Washington Post is actually since Bezos owns the Washington Post and Bloomberg owns Bloomberg News. I wanted to address though that there is not, if there is conflict of interest with Bezos and the Washington Post, it is very minuscule, but I cannot say the same for Bloomberg, especially during his presidential bid, which we all know how that went.
Spend all of his own money and not dent his wealth remotely.
Yeah.
And then
No. But I did want to touch on you saying that Pod Save America is more of a left podcast.
No, it's certainly a left podcast. I'm not debating that at all.
I would sort of it like coming from my perspective, it's
more so
very
center
left.
It's center left for sure, but it's definitely left at the we can the specifics don't really matter.
It's left. It's left in American politics.
Yes,
it is probably, I would say, the dead center when it comes to global politics. And
they have the overarching brand is Crooked Media, but they have a podcast called Pod Save the World where they discuss world issues, which is it's pretty interesting. I've listened to it a couple times, but there's so much going on in our own country that I feel overwhelmed listening to the world's problems. Well, and that might be narcissistic of me.
It's actually not. There's this really interesting, people make fun of Americans all the time for our inability to draw a map of our own country. But it's really interesting
to draw.
It is very hard. Have you ever tried to draw Florida? You can't do that alone, let alone attach it to the rest of the country.
You could also exclude it, though. No. I'm just messing. Just messing.
So
Floridians, you're okay.
So anyway, there's this thing about what you pay attention to, and it's actually limited geographically. So you only care about things generally that fall within your state, and then even more generally within your zone. So we care roughly about I care roughly about the Northeast, and I care about what happens in New York. And as you get closer to where I actually live, I care more. The problem is America is the size of Europe.
Yeah, America's huge. And so it's funny you mentioned that, because I was reading this thing, and I think this is a good place to tie this up or close this out. Is I was reading this article, and it was talking about it was talking about Americans and how Americans aren't really familiar with world affairs, and most of that, or at least even basic geography of the world. And it's part of the reason that we don't do that is that some of our states are the size of other countries. A lot of our states are the size of other countries. And so we have these giant we're basically a nation of countries, if you just change the term of state, because even the states have their own government. We're just a union of countries.
I suppose you could call us a united group of states.
Yeah. See, that's a great It's a
Can
great term.
Can we coin that? Is that trademarked?
I don't think so.
I think it's whatever is higher than trademarked.
Patent?
Patent.
Let's patent it. Sell it on a T-shirt. But all right, that'll do it for us today.
Yeah, a bit of a shorter one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit
Still
of a
good.
shorter one. Yeah, I think we still got a lot out there. But
Yeah.
Also, just Andy, to mention something that you talked about at the beginning with CNN, CNN's online business being a lot more neutral and like well reported. That's because that is curated by the larger CNN group. Because CNN's global coverage, surprisingly, is very, very good.
Well, I mean,
It's
also
just their domestic
online
news.
their online stuff isn't based on ratings, on show ratings.
it's
Yeah.
based on clicks. So the headlines are the only important thing that matters, which is like
Yeah.
newspaper based.
CNN cable in
but-
the U.S. That's the downside of CNN.
Yeah.
But
All right.
think that's it for us today.
All right. Remember, like and subscribe. that is the important message to get away from today. The media
And
is based
share.
on
And share.
Oh, and share. Media is based on clicks, and we need you to click.
Think
And
about this
the
though.
thing we need you to click is the subscribe button.
Think about this though.
Please.
If we grow bigger, then we like and subscribe won't even be valid anymore because that's not the same platform.
Exactly. All right.
All right.
Well, catch you guys around. I'm gonna go get tested for COVID.
All right. Good luck, man.
Same here.
All right.
Adios.